Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scicomm Monday. Thank you to everyone for sticking around. We're live streaming on Periscope, and it's a newer format of things, so there's always chances of things going wrong, chances of things that could go wrong, but we're going to give this a go again and see if we can get everyone's comments in, because we really want to be able to hear from everyone. So that's why we're sticking around for a second or third half hour now. So
whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. Yes, definitely. So if you're new to the broadcast, please feel free to send in all your questions and comments via the chat module on Periscope here. If you're watching this on replay, feel free to tweet myself either at the Scicomm Monday handle or at the WildlifeBioGal handle, and we'll try to engage with your questions that way. So today's guest, who has been gracious enough to stick around for yet a little bit more fun and have the whole deja vu of doing this over again, is Dr. Joanna Huxster. You can reach her at doc_hux on Twitter. And with that, I just got to say, Joanna, thanks for sticking around. It's great.
Of course. Anytime.
Yeah, it seemed more fun to let everyone in on the conversation that we had for about a good 20 minutes without anyone being there. So.
Great conversation. I'm sorry you all missed it.
Yeah. But yeah, so any questions that any of you have when it comes to climate change and engagement, or that you have for Joe, definitely feel free to start sending them, and because that's the whole point of this show, is to get that engagement from everyone. So for like the few people who actually weren't tuned in during our first two attempts with this broadcast today, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself, Joe?
I work at, I actually just finished working at Bucknell University on a project called the Production of Public Understanding of Science, and I studied marine policy with a concentration in climate change communication, and I'm going to start an assistant professorship at Eckerd College this fall, and I will be teaching environmental communication and climate change communication and intro courses in environmental studies.
Great. Are you excited about the fun of starting a whole new program, down somewhere else? Like I've talked to other professors that I know, and it always seems like that first semester is really quite a fun ride, is how they usually tend to put it.
Right. Type 2 fun.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. I'm really excited because these courses, the environmental communication course and the climate change communication course that I'm developing, this is the first time that I'm really fleshing these out, and I'm going to get to teach them. So I'm really excited to see how a topic that I've taught as like a section of a climate change course, how I can flesh it out into a full course by itself, because this is what I really do. I do public understanding of science and public understanding of climate change and climate change communication. So getting to teach something I'm passionate about is really exciting for me. So hopefully I enjoy it as much as I think I'm going to enjoy it.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how people get started in their careers, and how it's that those first couple of years of fun of being a professor. It's a lot of just dashing to like keep up with everything.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So why don't you talk to us a little bit about what climate change actually is? So for those people who are tuning in and just randomly found this on Periscope, can be kind of brought up to speed with the scientists that are also tuning in as well.
So we talked about climate change earlier as being the climate change is actually the larger process in which the Earth's climate fluctuates over time. And anthropogenic climate change and recent rapid climate change is what has been due to an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere due to human activity, specifically since we started burning fossil fuels for energy in the Industrial Revolution. And climate change refers to all of the aspects of the climate that are changing because of an increase in global temperatures, which is called global warming. So global warming means the increase in average temperature of the lower levels of the atmosphere and the Earth's surface. And climate change refers to all of the things that go along with that. So that includes increases in precipitation or changes in precipitation patterns like drought, increases in storm frequency. Those are all changes in climate, and then global warming is just that temperature increase. And that's something that people commonly confuse or think of as exactly the same thing. And you can talk about them as the same thing when you're having conversations about climate or about global warming, especially if people seem to be more comfortable with one word over the other, or one term over the other. But they actually mean slightly different things.
Great. So for those of you who are currently watching, definitely feel free to send in your questions. We love to have that active engagement. So when it comes to climate change, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have when it comes to climate change? Even for those of us who are scientists that might have, misconceptions about it.
Mm-hmm. So some of the things that I usually talk about with misconceptions, well, first of all, there's misconceptions about whether or not current rapid climate change is caused by human influences or not. And there's misconceptions about whether or not there's a scientific consensus about that. If you ask the average American about whether or not scientists agree that there is climate change, many of them will grossly underestimate the number of climate scientists who believe that climate change is because of anthropogenic causes and have studied that. But also there are misconceptions about the difference between weather and climate. Weather is the day-to-day pattern or on a very local level of what's going on around you, whereas climate is a much longer term and larger area term. So I like to say to my students, and I said this earlier, so if you've heard this already, I'm sorry, but climate is how you choose where it is you're going to go for vacation, and then weather is how you choose what you're going to pack on that individual trip. So they are different things that are related to one another.
Is that something that people are always as you're talking to folks, that's just super common, they're always flipping those two back and forth?
Yes, and people frequently flip them back and forth, and also it is a way that makes it difficult for people to understand that climate change is happening, because on a day-to-day basis they say, well, it's cold outside right now, or a senator comes and throws a snowball in the Senate, because that's weather, and individual days of weather aren't climate. And it also makes it difficult to communicate about climate change, because people have these misconceptions that if it's cold outside right now, that the climate isn't changing and that the earth isn't warming. But also because things like weather are driven by multiple factors coming in at once, you can't contribute or attribute one individual storm to climate change, for instance. So when people say that Hurricane Sandy was because of climate change, you can't say that. We can't, scientists can't say that, but you can say that Sandy was more likely to occur because of climate change, and more storms like Sandy are more likely to continue occurring because of climate change. And those sort of nuances are the types of things that make it really difficult for people to understand really what climate change is. So that difference between weather and climate is an important distinction to make, and if people get that, they may have a better chance of understanding why it is it can still snow outside. And why it is maybe in some places it's actually more likely to snow than it ever was, because of changes in climate. Right.
So if we get a 60-degree day in January here in Michigan, which is just absolutely insane. That just doesn't happen. We always have some melts, but to have it be 60 degrees and people were showing up out at the beaches on the Great Lakes, it was just so shocking. But that one individual day doesn't necessarily mean that there's climate change. It'd be when there's that trend of that there's multiple days that build up throughout the years, and it's because of certain issues, like you said, that anthropogenic or that human caused climate change is causing those trends of the days to pop up.
Right. So I can't say that, next January you will have that many days that are 60 degrees, but I can say it's more likely that you will have 60-degree days in January, which doesn't sound so bad right this second, but in some places that also means that it's more likely that they will never get rain, or for instance in Pennsylvania that we'll have many, many days over 90 degrees. So in our January, we actually ended up with a couple of days in the 80s, which was just weird. So that the fact that could happen, and that the chances of that happening increase, that is that can be attributed to climate change.
So we had a question come in asking, would climate change happen without human activity? I believe was what the question was asked.
That's a good question. So, I mean, the Earth's climate has, of course, changed over time, and people talk about that all the time, and they like to bring that up. What climate change in general would happen without human activity. In fact, one of the things that's been posited recently is that we would actually be starting to move towards an ice age right now if it hadn't been for human activity. And that's something that's been talked about a fair amount in the science. But what we are seeing, what we wouldn't be seeing if it weren't for human activity, we wouldn't be seeing the drastic increase in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And because of that, we wouldn't be seeing this drastic increase in global temperatures. And that part can only be attributed to human activity. And there are, you can look at graphs of what kinds of solar radiation has been changing over time and how volcanic activity has changed over time and how the Earth's orbit has changed over time. And none of those factors can predict the drastic increase in temperatures that we've seen. And the only thing that really matches up with that is the combination of our greenhouse gas emissions and our aerosol emissions. Because if you just follow the greenhouse gas emissions, we actually would be higher, it would be warmer than it is now. But our aerosol emissions, which are bad for other reasons like acid rain, actually create a little bit of global cooling. So that matches up almost perfectly with the temperature observations that we make now. So, for instance, there's this graph up that Nicole has put up that shows using ice core data going back 800,000 years. It shows how our how Earth's temperature fluctuates along the same lines as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if you look at that over the last 800,000 years, you'll see that we move 200 parts per million in carbon dioxide and our temperature changes drastically. But what you see at the end of that graph is a sharp upswing. And that sharp upswing starts right at the Industrial Revolution or just after. And that's a sharp upswing in carbon dioxide and a sharp upswing in temperature following that. And that can only be explained by human activity.
Yeah, so like you're talking about ice core data. So can you tell us a little bit about how scientists are using these ice cores to be able to get this data? Because that's one of the questions that my family has asked me was, so how do you know what the temperature was 20,000 years ago?
Ice core data is so cool. So they drill into, a massive ice sheet and they pull out these beautiful, clear cores. And just like rings of a tree, they actually have these striations in them. And those are markings of time. And the way that they can determine the concentration of different chemicals in the atmosphere and the temperature is by little bubbles of air that are trapped in those ice cores. And the types of gas that's in those ice cores can help them to determine both what the atmosphere looked like, what was in it, and the temperature based on different isotopes there. So it's really, really neat. And they can use that ice core data to track back our temperature and our carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere for up to 800,000 years, depending where they're able to get those cores. So that stuff is really interesting and well-known and solid science that's been followed for a very long time.
Yeah, so we had a comment come in saying that didn't Al Gore say that New York was going to be underwater? So I guess could you explain a little bit of some of the processes of how much time are we talking about before some of these big drastic impacts that we've been predicting could be happening? Because I've heard that there's islands out in the Pacific that are starting to have issues with flooding because of the sea level rises.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things about we always talk about is in uncertainty dealing with climate change is uncertainty in our predictions of what exactly are going to happen. And one of the main reasons for that is we aren't really sure what humans are going to do. We aren't sure if we're going to deal with this or not. So how quickly it takes, for instance, the flooding to happen that would take over New York, I mean, part of that has a lot to do with what we do. If we continue to burn greenhouse gases the way we are, and we continue with the upswing in burning of fossil fuels, we don't burn the greenhouse gases. If we burn the fossil fuels the same way that we are now, that will happen more quickly. If we start to deal with it now, it won't happen. It'll take more time. Unfortunately, we've already committed ourselves to about 2, maybe more degrees of climate change, of increase in temperature globally, as it already is. So one of the things with carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect is that there's actually a delay in the effect. So the things we're seeing right now come from emissions that were made many years ago. So even if we were to stop 100% putting out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases today, which is, we can't do that right this second, but if we were to do that, we would still see an increase in temperature and we would still see sea level rise. But the timing, the exact timing of that, we can't know because we can't predict how humans are going to act. But there are, multiple scenarios that we've tried to map out. And there are already places that are going underwater. So for instance, the Maldives, those islands have been rapidly losing shoreline, and they will continue to do so. And the predictions now are that with 2 degrees climate change, those islands may actually still be completely wiped out. And in which case we're going to have refugees from those. We're going to have environmental refugees who need to go somewhere. The timelines on the U.S. are obviously we're a little more above sea level. And we're also in colder areas. So the expansion of the water, although there's globally, the whole ocean is going to expand. We aren't going to see some of the same problems. We aren't going to lose all of New York, probably, especially if we deal with this now. But we will have some flooding and some higher sea levels. What we will also have is when a storm comes in, there will be higher storm surges and there will be more damage from the storms. So it's not necessarily that all of the streets of in New York are going to be covered in water. It's that the storms are going to create more damage like they did with Sandy than they would have otherwise, because they're going to come in stronger and the sea level is going to be slightly higher. But places like Florida are going to lose a fair amount of land, even if we don't do anything. I mean, even if we stop everything now, we're still going to lose some of Florida because it is so low lying.
Yeah, so I've heard that there's already some changes in Miami. They're actually having flooding that they're attributing to climate change down there, and that it's I can't remember if it was Miami where it was the picture of the octopus that was in a parking garage or something along those lines, and they're like, it's happening. Yeah.
And like we said, we can't say that this one individual flood was definitely because of climate change, but the more frequently they happen, and the more frequently they happen at rates that we have never seen before, is when we can say, yeah, the pattern is pretty clear here. So, I think one of the things we're going to see that's going to be really interesting, I think, this is just a personal prediction, although I've seen other people say it, is that we're going to see some real push from insurance companies to deal with climate, because they're going to be on the hook for things like damage from storms and flooding and things of that nature. So we're going to see a real difference in things like flood insurance rates, which are already pretty high in Florida. But that's a whole different topic. It's not where my expertise lies.
No, but I mean, that's an interesting aspect, though, is maybe some of those economic drivers could be the thing that helps push people to accept that climate change is actually happening as they start seeing maybe their insurance bills go up and this really is something that we need to pay attention to.
So when we do climate change communication, one of the things we do is something called framing, which is where you try to talk about climate change in terms of a subject that means the most to the person you're talking to. And economic framing can be a tricky one because there are a lot of things about how we're going to have to deal with climate that go beyond things like laissez-faire economics and the free market economy. So we're going to have more regulation. It's just going to have to happen. But when you talk about climate change with people, if you are talking to somebody who cares a lot about the economy and cares a lot about impacts to themselves personally or impacts to the economy of the country, that is one way to actually talk about climate change that might make sense to them, because the economic impacts of dealing with extra flooding and extra storms. And there's going to be rising healthcare costs due to heat exposure and asthma increases. There's going to be extra health costs associated with disease spread. So these are ways of talking about climate change that may actually ring a bell for somebody who does not care about a polar bear, and doesn't even necessarily care, not that they're heartless, but it's hard to think about somebody living far, far away on the other side of the world who's being impacted. If you bring it closer to home, and to a subject that matters to them, and it can even be a lighthearted subject, like, for instance, if you know someone who loves snowboarding or skiing, talking about the impacts on snowfall, which have already been recorded in the West and some here in Pennsylvania as well, how it's going to impact even their hobbies, might be something that just flips a switch for them when you're trying to talk about climate.
Right, yeah, because like this past winter, I like going snowshoeing. I didn't go snowshoeing once at all, and I live up in Michigan, which, we get a lot of that lake effect snow, and it just wasn't there enough to like make it worth truly getting them out. Like, yeah, I got them out of the bag, and I think I walked in the backyard for about 2 feet, and that was about it. And I'm just like, it's not even worth it. Even as badly as I want to go out and use them, it's just like, it's not worth it.
Yeah. And you may, you'll probably get to snowshoe again. It's not over. Next winter might be better, but over time there'll be fewer and fewer winters with good snowshoeing or good snowboarding. And it's hard for me to frame it in terms of things like that because I find the human impact parts of it, and the biological impacts and the ecological impacts, those are the things that are really gut-wrenching to me. But it might be that someone would care about those things, but they haven't really found the topic that connects climate to them personally, and that's when they would start to really delve into it and understand more.
Right. So one of the things that I've been seeing a lot on the different boards and platforms that I follow is scientists and other people who are, interested in science. How do they talk to their family and friends, or maybe even like their, social media communities about climate change? So if you were to like start that conversation up with one of your family or friends or Facebook pals, like how would you broach the subject in a way that they can understand it and get it?
Yeah. So I always say that one of the first things you need to do is to know your audience. And so if you're talking with a friend or a family member, you probably have some kind of idea where they're coming from, what their political background is, what interests them. And that gives you a good place to start a conversation with them. If you don't know the person at all, or have just met someone, or someone has started this conversation with you, one of the first things you can do is try to get that understanding, to ask a few questions to really get to know where they are with the science. Do they know the science? Do they understand it? Do they not believe in it? And getting that background can really help shape how you have the rest of the conversation. It's always awkward to just walk up to somebody and say, hey, I'm worried about climate change. Are you? But that can be one of the ways to do it, is to just sort of bring it up as something that you've been thinking about a lot recently, and then ask them questions instead of just start preaching about how climate change works and what the science is. Asking them questions about what are they concerned about, what bothers them. And a lot of times what you're going to get is someone saying, I believe in climate change, or I'm worried about climate change, but I have so many other things to worry about right now. And the next step for me is to find a grain of truth in what they say. So if they say that, I might say, you know what, you are right. There are so many things to worry about right now. What are you most concerned with? And by asking that, you're going to get an idea about where their values lie. You're going to get to know if economics are something they're concerned about, or if they're concerned about immigration, or if they're concerned about, feeding their family that day. And that can help act as a bridge into climate change. One of the things I pride myself on being able to do is find a connection between almost anything and climate. Because as soon as you can do that, you can have that conversation with anybody. And then the other really big important thing that I always say is that you should set a goal for yourself in these conversations. So especially if you're going into a conversation with someone you think might argue with you or may disagree with you, to have a goal in mind of where you want to go. And that doesn't necessarily have to be to win a fight or to win an argument or to convert them into an environmentalist. The goal of the conversation can simply to hear them and to be heard. or to introduce to them a new type of renewable energy that they hadn't thought of, or to just make that one connection, one step connection further with them where they hadn't really thought about how dealing with climate change was going to actually have less of a negative economic impact than having climate change happen, which all of the economic studies show that this is true. I mean, yes, there will be economic problems that come from dealing with climate change, but they're nothing compared to the economic issues we're going to get into for not dealing with it. So if you come in with this goal for yourself, rather than I'm going to win this, it becomes less intimidating for you as well, because you don't feel the same kind of pressure. All you have to do is, have the conversation and be proud of yourself for doing it, rather than, finding a new believer.
Yeah, and speaking of the different things that are driving people's beliefs or understanding of climate change is the thought process of that it's really dividing along party lines, at least here in the U.S. I'm not 100% sure about the rest of the world. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, is that something that's new, or has that been ongoing?
So it's relatively new. And by that, I mean that the real partisan divide over climate change happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. Before that, we all sort of believed the same thing. And then that divide became part of the political conversation. And when that happened, it started to create this increasing divide between conservatives or Republicans and Democrats or liberals. And this divide has been, like actually many political subjects, it has been increasing over time. And so one of the things that I used to study was what drives that divide. So I would use aggregate public opinion data. I would get all of these public opinion data and sources and bring them in and then analyze them over long periods of time and see how we moved over time. And then try to attribute that to different things, like, is it because of changes in weather patterns or changes in media or changes in politics? Those drivers we can actually link up to the public opinion data. And you can see that there's an effect of political elite. So when someone high up in a political party has a specific view and makes a statement, that tends to make the greatest change on public opinion. Now, that's usually filtered through the media, right? You don't actually, unless you're watching C-SPAN, you probably don't see that person say it himself. But the media then helps to show that. And one of the studies we put out recently actually shows something called the echo chamber and the boomerang effect. And so the echo chamber means that conservative media tends to only broadcast and tailor their message towards their conservative viewers. So it's called an echo chamber, whereas liberal media tends to only broadcast and tailor its message toward liberal viewers. So that helps drive this separation. And we also see, in some cases, something called the boomerang effect, which is if a liberal media source sends out a message that climate change is happening, climate change is real, you'll actually see a dip in belief in conservatives. They're actually reacting negatively to that message because it comes from the other side. So this political divide is just getting greater right now. And that's kind of scary for climate communication. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is finding ways to talk about the science as not political. The science itself is not political. The earth itself does not care where you voted or who you voted for. And nature always bats last. So in the end, we're all going to be affected the same way. So we have to find ways to talk about the science that move past the politics. Once we get into the solutions, that becomes political. And I understand that, everybody's going to have a different opinion about what the right thing to do is. But we have to get everybody on board with the science first. And we just aren't there yet. Yeah, so that's the tough part.
Yeah, I was going to say, why do you think people aren't believing the scientists? It seems like they just don't want to trust what it is that we're saying, even though we're trying to be as objective as possible. I mean, it's completely impossible to be 100% objective, because your influences of your life will always find their way into your science slightly. But I like to think that most scientists out there try to be as objective as possible when it comes to discussing these things. So why do you think there is that discrepancy between the public believing what the science is saying and having their own beliefs when it comes to different issues?
This is actually what I'm most heavily into studying right now, which is why science communication doesn't work the way we think it should. So there's been this long-standing belief in science communication called the deficit model, which was basically, and it's mostly been, it's not as heavily believed in now, but it was that the public just doesn't know, and so we just need to give them more information, and the more information we give them, the more they will understand and come to the scientific consensus. It was like this ignorant public view, and that's just not true. I mean, we do have relatively low levels of science literacy in the United States, but they're not much lower than anywhere else in the world and than any of the other more developed nations that don't have the kind of political divide that we do. So it's not that the public doesn't know or that we can just give them more information. It's that the way that we psychologically take in information is not as an empty sponge. We filter everything that comes into us through our pre-existing beliefs and our ideology. So we are able to take information that comes to us and fit it into the model that we already have about how the world works. So if I'm already part of a tribe that believes that vaccines cause autism or climate change isn't real, then all of the new information that I get, I'm going to put through that filter. And so there's actually some really interesting studies, for instance, done by Dan Gahan at Yale University, where he showed that actually as people's science literacy increased, there was more of a polarization on beliefs. So as Republicans, for instance, got more information or had more scientific knowledge, their belief in climate change or their concern for climate change actually goes down because they're able to use that information in what's called motivated reasoning to help further bolster the ideologies they already have. And that holds true with lots of different subjects, and it's not just conservatives who do it, liberals do it for other things. So for GMO safety, for instance, no matter how much, if you give people more science about the safety of GMOs, they're going to filter it through the ideology they already have, and they will actually continue to widen. So the idea of the deficit model has been sort of, it's looked down on now. It's been sort of, I wouldn't say debunked, because you still have to give people information, right? Like, knowledge doesn't come from a vacuum. You still have to give it to people, but you have to change the way in which it's delivered. You can't just expect that showing someone a graph is going to change their ideological background. It doesn't work that way. So that's one of the things that I'm fascinated with right now and that I'm trying to work on right now. Finding new ways to measure people's concern and their science literacy and how to line those up. And what types of information can you give people that help them to trust scientists more and trust in the expertise of scientists? And also, what ways can scientists be better communicators? Because we don't do it very well. We historically have not done it very well. So what can we do better?
Yeah, do you think some of that might be that people just can't relate to scientists? Like I know that there was a Twitter hashtag that was going out a little while ago called like actual living scientists, where there was a study that came out that said like most people can't name an actual living scientist. So all the different scientists that are on Twitter and the other different platforms were trying to introduce themselves and show off like, hey, we're just normal people too. We're not always in that lab coat setting that most people think of when they think of a scientist. There's many different kinds of scientists. Like I'm an ecologist. I go out and I play in wetlands in the Great Lakes with mute swans and other species out there. I'm very rarely in a lab coat. So.
Yeah. And so that is really interesting. There are a bunch of different studies like that. People don't know can't name a living scientist, or they name someone who's alive but who isn't a scientist, like Al Gore. And there's also really interesting studies like Draw a Scientist, where they go in and ask students to draw scientists, and they invariably draw those guys, white men with crazy hair in a lab. And you see these, and they're kids. So part of it is the education system, of course, but also part of it is scientists. We haven't been trained to be public figures. We are discouraged in our communities from activism because it's not considered objective. It's not considered scientific. And so people don't really relate to scientists, and they don't really know that much about how science works. And so one of the things I'm studying right now is actually public understanding of how science works, not at like the scientific method, like create a hypothesis level, but at the level of the social interaction between scientists. So how does competition work in science? How do scientists get paid? One common misconception is that if a scientist receives $1 million grant, that they now have $1 million salary. And that's just not true. I mean, but people.
Yeah, I mean, like the percentage that you'll get of that grant is so minuscule by the time like the money goes to the university, it goes to pay your grad students, it goes to all the like the transportation costs it takes, the equipment. I mean, so like the money that actually hits that scientist's personal pocketbook is like a small percentage of that $1 million.
Yeah, and then you can sort of trace that to that common misconception that climate scientists, not that common, but one of the assertions that people make is that climate scientists are making up climate change to make more money. That just doesn't work that way. I mean, they would actually, one of the things that Michael Mann says that's really interesting is a scientist would actually be more famous if they could disprove climate change, because the vast majority of scientists have come to this consensus. So if you could do the one thing that makes you stand out as different, that's how you're going to get famous, right? But you can't, because it's like the evidence is overwhelming. But again, trying to get people to understand or testing even, do people know where the funding comes from, or how peer review works, or why it is that what a consensus means in science. Does it just mean that like everybody came into a room together and said yes, or how much work goes into a consensus? So that level of understanding of science is what I'm really fascinated with finding right now. And my project here at Bucknell, Public Production and Public Understanding of Science, we've been working on a measure for that, because that may be a better indicator of concern over climate change, for instance, or having beliefs consistent with the scientific consensus on a vast majority of other politically controversial sciences.
Right. So we're just about out of time here. So I just have like, so for anyone out there, if you have any last minute questions, definitely send them in. And I've got a question. And so like we talk about us, traditionally not being great communicators as scientists. And I know there's a lot of scientists out there that are doing a lot of great communication, but you see kind of like you're more of the boots on the street kind of thing, like where you actually are engaging with those people and seeing what they're coming back with. I think a lot of us are communicating in that echo chamber that you talked about earlier, where we talk to other scientists on Twitter and we're not always necessarily doing that outreach. So I guess what kind of advice would you have for different scientists out there to help them to engage with that public, so that way we are kind of branching out of that echo chamber and like having more impact with the general public?
Yeah, that's really difficult to do because you can get on social media all you want, but if people aren't following you who aren't scientists, they aren't going to see it. I think something like what you're doing right now is really important, and trying to find ways to share it beyond the scientific community is really important. And any sort of science communication outreach that can be done is really helpful. I think also it means things like talking to people around you about your science, people who aren't your colleagues, family members or friends of family members, or your neighbor, making it clear to them that they know a scientist, and that you are whoever you are, you're male, you're female, you're a person of color, you're, somebody other than who they're picturing in the lab. I think that's really important. There was a recent sort of campaign to get scientists to run for political office. And I actually think that would be really interesting and really important to even get involved in local politics at some level. If especially if you're in a different stage of your career than I am, it's not really going to make sense for me right now, but that's something I would consider doing later in life. And getting involved in local groups, local organizations. There's probably, if you do some sort of environmental science or even just care about climate, getting involved in local environmental organizations, there's a scientist in that group with them. that can be helpful for them, and it can be helpful for the local community to understand where the scientists are among them, especially if it's outside of the university setting in some way.
That's some good advice, because I know that I just found out apparently we have a local birding club in my hometown, which I had never heard of before, but it'd be interesting to know, like, how many times do they actually engage with a real scientist to have them in? And like when they found out like what it is I do, they're like, oh, can you come talk to us sometime about it?
I mean,
so it's just little things like that are a great way to engage with people that might not otherwise hear about. And there's still people who they're interested in the outdoors and nature, and they still might not necessarily engage with a scientist unless like you go and become a part of that and sit in and offer to like go talk to them.
Yeah, no, people really do care. I mean, even if there are local community places where people, do presentations in the local community, you get community members who show up. People are interested. They just haven't had the scientists aren't coming out and doing it. So getting involved in any way you can locally is really excellent. I started hosting a series of workshops here called Communicating Beyond the Choir that are about how to talk about climate change to your, neighbor who you think might not agree with you. And here where I live, there are a lot of people who don't agree. So doing stuff like that, I think, is exceptionally important. I definitely recommend that. And if you want to talk a lot about climate change and you want to understand how people understand it and why people think about it the way they do, I really recommend this book. I didn't write it, so this is not a plug for me. I don't know per Espen Stoknes, but I teach this in my class. It's called What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. And it goes into a lot of the psychology and the sociology, and then gets into communication strategies. So that's a really good one if you are looking to understand what's going on in people's minds, and know that they're not stupid or mean. They just have a different ideology than you do.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely a big thing to remember is where they're coming from is different from where you're coming from. So their understanding of things is going to be different. And so you just have to work through their biases and also your biases as you're coming together to try to help everyone understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So working through your own biases is really important for this.
So with that, as much as I would love to keep talking, because this has just been fun, because we've been talking for the last hour and a half now,
several hours
with all the various attempts with this, I'm gonna let you go so that way you can actually have the rest of your evening.
I'm gonna go watch Wonder Woman.
Ooh, I've yet to go see that, and I really want to go see that.
I hear a really good thing.
Yeah, I was supposed to go with my niece and nephew, and they didn't come this weekend, but I definitely want to go see that, because I just like the whole idea of that positive woman for that. So, and plus it just looks really cool too.
Yeah, it's been really good.
So, but with that, thank you, Joe, for coming in and talking to everyone and sticking around through all the multiple attempts to get this broadcast out. It sounds like through my ear that it's worked this time. So hopefully we're good to go.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, it's been a real pleasure. So if you have further questions for Joe, definitely feel free to tweet her at doc_Hux. And also, if you're watching this on replay, definitely feel free to engage with her that way. If you're want to talk to myself or about the broadcast, feel free to either engage with me at the Scicomm Monday handle or at my personal handle of WildlifeBioGal. And then for everyone to tune in for next week, we'll be talking to Dr. David Coyle. He's out of the University of Georgia, and he deals with forest health. So we're going to be talking about how invasive species, climate change, and a whole bunch of other factors can impact the health of the different forests in the Southeast and greater. And then I also want to definitely send a quick shout out to Amanda Hips. She's a grad student at Florida Atlantic University. She correctly guessed what species and character I was talking about on Zootopia with my Instagram challenge that I threw out for everyone. So please follow her both on Instagram and Twitter. She does a lot of great science communication, and she works with what species are burrowing in or using tortoise burrows down there in the Southeast. So follow along with her. And then for all of my Twitter patrons out there, thank you very much for helping support this broadcast. It really is appreciated. Without you, this would not happen. And then for anyone out there who enjoyed the broadcast, please go to our Patreon page and see how you can help us to make sure that this science communication keeps going and we're able to share it with everyone out there. And with that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Please go out, explore, do some science, have some fun, and we'll see you next time on Scicomm Monday.